The title of my talk is Analysis and Annotation of Coreference for Contrastive and Translation Studies, because I am a member of an institute which used to be called Applied Linguistics and Translation and Interpreting Studies, but now we're conjoined with computational linguistics, and we are called Language, Science and Technology. But part of our students are trained to be translators. Well, we have a new program which is more like technology for translations, but also just translating. And that's why we are also interested in the results of our analysis in application for contrastive linguistics, because contrasting languages are important for translation and for translation studies. And I will start with briefly introducing main concepts, which probably are familiar already for you, and then I will show you 4 case studies from my work, which illustrate 2 methodological directions. I will tell you in a couple of minutes what I mean here. So first of all, just a reminder, what is coreference or coreference chain? We call all dimensions of one and the same entity. Sometimes it's not an entity, but an abstract some abstract concept, for example, event or state. We include event and states in the analysis of coreference for the whole text. And here you see an example where we have 2 sentences and they are interconnected with the help of coreference chain, where we have the entity Donald Graham, and we have an indefinite pronoun a husband, which is an antecedent. We call antecedent the first element, and then we have possessive pronoun, reflexive pronoun. We have a nominal phrase with a proper name, which are members of the same chain, of coreferential chain. And in some networks there are also they also include 0 elements, like for example gerund killing, like he kills. Which is not included in the frameworks that I have been working with. But for some languages, I have been working with English and German, that's why we don't include it, but for some languages, like Slavic languages, where you have a lot of prodrops, you probably need to include these elements as well. And as I mentioned, my interest is in English and German, like working in Germany and dealing mostly with the students who are studying English and being translated from English into German. It's important to know, first of all, okay, how do coreference chains look like in English and German? Yeah, so what elements can we include there? What are the linguistic means expressing coreference in both languages? And we were also interested in further discourse-related devices, or coreference-related phenomena, such as we call them DRD within the text link, where we met actually in the text link cost initiative. DRD is a discourse relational device, which is a connector, and so on. But we also have substitution, ellipsis, lexical cohesion, so other means expressing, let's say, some relations throughout the text and linking the text. And from the point of view of contrastive linguistics, we are interested in the differences between the languages. Let's say the relation of identity that coreference exists in all languages, but the means how the relation is expressed differ. Yeah, so these what we have in the sentences, and that's why we're interested in these differences that trigger maybe the same relation. From the point of view of translation studies, we are interested again in the differences in the realization of the same meaning, just because when we transfer from one language into another, then we want to know what is the corresponding, what is the equivalence in the target language, for example. And from the point of view of resource compilation, if you have a look at the resources which are annotated, which are available and annotated for coreference for both languages, for English and German, then there are not so many. Well, at least I know just the Gecko corpus, PARCOR corpus, and a small corpus by Julia Grishin and Manfred Stede. So there are not so many resources. This is a kind of motivation why we analyze this. Now I mentioned at the beginning I have 4 different studies which can be subdivided into 2 methodological directions, like working with contrastive linguists and translation scholars. We either start with the theory or we start from the data. And if we start from the theory, we use the existing theoretical knowledge to represent somehow let's say, for example, we work with coreference. Okay, we say, how does coreference look like? What do we include from the point of view of this theoretical framework into the categories? And if we start with the data, we analyze the data and try to interpret in terms of theories what we see in the data. Yeah, what is happening in the data from the linguistic point of view. So again, we have existing theories or grammars that we use for the formulation of categories existing in both languages. Especially in the process of annotation. If we speak about annotation, about marking the categories in the texts, we need to know what exists in the language that may trigger a relation of coreference. And these categories are operationalized in terms of linguistic features, so lexicogrammatical patterns such as pronouns, nominal phrases, and other linguistic means. Then we annotate them, so mark them in the corpora, and then the annotated resources are used for either empirical analysis, like in the case of contrastive and translation studies, or as training data for natural language processing. And if we start the other way around, so we start with parallel or comparable corpora, we use shallow features, for example, just annotation on the basis of tokens or parts of speech, which we can automatically get, or some outputs from a parser, and then extract patterns and try to interpret them with theoretical framework, saying, okay, this is a structure which belongs to a coreference chain. And we try to interpret some structures in terms of existing studies, existing grammars. So the first 2 studies that I'm going to show you are actually from this first methodological direction top down, meaning that we use some frameworks to find out what are the categories representing English and German coreference chains, and then we annotate them manually in the corpus, and this corpus is used for some analysis. And the first study was performed within the project called GECCO. I mentioned the corpus GECCO. GECCO stands for German English Contrast in Cohesion. Yeah, Cohesion. Coreference is a part of Cohesion. And the project ran for 5 years in Saarbrücken. We had funding for 5 years from Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, German funding society, and it was so not only me, but also my colleague Kerstin Kunz, which moved to Heidelberg University, and then Erich Steiner, and with some further colleagues involved there. And we took not only coreference, but cohesion in general, which means that we have coreference, which expresses the relation of identity, because we have the same entity or the same event that is referred to throughout a text. But there are other means, such as substitution, ellipsis, or comparative reference, cohesive conjunction, lexical cohesion, that differ from a coreference through the meaning that they express. For example, we have similarity relation in case of lexical cohesion, and sometimes, so something like factors are included into some coreference frameworks as well, because they are also identities. But having a text, it might have also factors which are not, which do not refer to the same identity. In this case, it's just a repetition of the same word. And here the framework, the theoretical framework that we used was Halide and Hassan, which was actually written for English, and our task was to analyze English and German. So we had to find the same categories for German, to make them comparable. And sometimes it's a hard task, even for the languages which are very similar. English and German belong to the same group, to the same family, and have a lot of categories in common, but there are differences on more fine-grained level. Which means that, okay, we say all these relations exist in the two languages, and these categories also exist in both languages. But if we look on the level of language, on the level of text, then we see the differences, and we are interested in these differences. And as the project was like 5 years, and we still have leftovers, and still working on some articles, and we are about to write. We are writing a book about cohesion in English and German. We haven't finished it yet, and my colleagues came with an idea to represent, the whole work with this kind of cube representing research design. So we have our 5 categories of cohesion, and we were interested in the differences in the degree of cohesion, strength of cohesion, topic variation, type of meaning relation, and variation in all these categories for the two languages, English and German, and also for written and spoken text in both languages, and including different registers. For example, you have fictional text instruction manuals, but we have also academic speeches and transcribed interviews. So the differences were not just in general for English and German, or for spoken and written language, but also for different registers. And so this is how our contrastive work was designed methodologically. And besides referring to this, let's say, scientific Bible by Khaled Hassan, we also had some references for example, language contrasts between English and German, mode of production, and registers. And referring to these studies, we analyzed the differences in terms of cohesion. So what we did, we took these abstract dimensions like degree of cohesion and tried to relate cohesive features or cohesive devices with these more abstract categories. And then for each variable, such as language mode and register, we extracted instances or frequencies of cohesive devices from a corpus and tried to perform some statistical analysis and interpret the results in terms of cohesion. So for example, for degree of cohesion, we ask what is the average proportion of cohesive devices per text. For strength of cohesive relation, for example, how explicit are cohesive devices, how close are elements in cohesive chains, so the distance between the elements, how long are cohesive chains. For types of meaning relations, for example, which relations are more important for English, which are more important for German, or which are more important in spoken registers and which are more important in written registers. And then for breadth of variation, we compared in general how much cohesive variation were there for all these 3 variables. So in fact, if you think in terms of NLP and training, for example, the coreference system, these are similar categories that I use them for. And here we use them for contrastive analysis. So we have a corpus called Gecko, and there are several versions of Gecko. So the biggest one was not completely annotated for coreference because the annotation of coreference was performed manually. But this part, so called Gecko Co or Gecko Cohesion, was annotated for all cohesive devices under analysis, except lexical cohesion. And you see that the number of, this is the number of tokens that, the size of the corpus is not that big, just because for the reason that it was annotated manually. But we have English and German, and we have several registers, like academic speeches, political essays, fictional text instruction manuals, interviews, popular scientific texts, letters to shareholders, political speeches, tourism, leaflets, and some, subcorpus called web. These are mostly like corporate identity websites, or more or less advertisement for companies. And a subset of this corpus was also annotated for lexical cohesion. We called it Gecko chain, just for the reason that we subtracted the part annotated for coreference. Coreference chains were also annotated here, but we subtracted a part and annotated for lexical cohesive chain because we combined them. Remember I said that some categories and lexical cohesion overlap with coreference, and actually was used for this analysis. So this part is even smaller, and so we have not only coreference and other cohesive devices, but also further annotations, and also some extra linguistic information, for example, speaker information, age, especially in the spoken registers. The annotation, I said it was performed manually. Well, actually, we started from automatic procedures. We used, so you know that some categories of coreference, for example, pronouns and nominal phrases, are easier to identify if you have part of speech data, for example, part of speech information, or if you run a parser, you have also some structures. And we said, okay, we can run some queries with some linguistic restrictions. For example, a pronoun used in the beginning of a sentence, which is a subject, is, for example, an antecedent, and then the following pronoun in the next sentence, which is in the position, in the function of an object. It could be a candidate for referring expression to this. And so we formulated this kind of, let's say, regular expression-based queries, and we use CQP, so Corpus Workbench, which is a part of Corpus Workbench, Stuttgart Corpus Workbench, and some Perl models within the older version of Corpus Workbench. And the idea was, so if you run a query, so actually you extract the information, but this functionality allowed us to say, okay, if my query works well, if my precision and recall is okay, and I'm satisfied with this, I can put a tag on it that this is a kind of good candidate for a coreference chain, and so we feed it back into the corpus. And so we had the tagging of the candidates for coreference chains, but we could not link the elements into the chains. And this step was manual, so we used a tool called Emacs, and with this tool we could add the links with the help of annotators and assigned, well, actually the categories were already assigned automatically. For example, that this is a demonstrative modifier. Demonstrative modifier means that, like for example, we have something like this book, and not this. This is a head, just demonstrative head, and demonstrative modifier because it modifies book. So the functions were assigned automatically, and then annotators went through it, linked the chains, and also corrected them automatic annotation. So we had kind of two procedures. On the one hand, evaluating the automatic procedures, and on the other hand, adding the chains. And the corpus is mainly used for contrastive studies. Well, it wasn't mainly used for contrastive studies within the project Gecko, but we also use it for teaching. And we have this CQP web for querying the corpus, so it's encoded in the CQP web. And if students are interested in the analysis of coreference, they can query it. I mentioned that for every abstract dimension that we had in this research design, we had to define categories which are represented on the level of a language, and so we used these kind of linguistic devices. For example, we analyze all antecedents or antecedent types. So for example, antecedent could be a nominal phrase, it could be a pronoun, it could be just a sentence or a part of sentence verbal phrase. And then we have different types of antecedents, anaphors, and then antecedents or anaphors being a subject and an object. So kind of features, linguistic features of members of coreferential chains, the same for substitution, conjunction, ellipsis, and lexical cohesion. So let's say we had a great number of different features that we used for the analysis, and there are many results, as I mentioned, because it was a project within which ran 5 years, and I'm not going to go into detail. If you're interested, we can talk about it later. And summarizing this project, I would like to say that, well, we have compiled, or we worked with a comparable corpus with annotation of full coreference chains and also other cohesive devices, which is a good resource for a variety of users. So applications so far were mainly in the projects Gecko and for teaching. Well, for future application, we would like to also to use the corpus to study mechanism for translation, because if we know the differences between English and German on the basis of comparable data, we think that we can also use it for translation, maybe also for machine translation, and also a resource for training and development of multilingual, also monolingual coreference resolution systems. I put a question mark here just because, well, part of the data in the corpus came from another project, from another corpus called Croco, and as this corpus was compiled, nobody took care of the authorship, right? So, which means that the sharing of this data is limited, so we can share some parts of the data with, we say actually, well, there are many issues. One say, if you have the annotations belong to you and you may share them, but the underlying texts, they belong to someone else, and it's difficult. But still, there are many possibilities. For example, it's possible to use it for academic purposes if there is a request. So we can't put it on the website and say you can download it and use it for training, but there are some ways for using this. But as I say, it's always a problem of copyright issues if you work with corpora. And the years ago, well, as I said, the Croco texts were compiled. We used this corpus just because it had already annotation of some other structures which were very interesting and important for us. And so we took those texts, but later we realized that we have some limitations. For example, if we would like to train some systems and we cannot share them later. And so it's not possible nowadays because in this case nobody can reproduce the results that you present. But it's okay for contrastive and translation studies. Okay, the second example is the project PowerCore Full. So I mentioned that there was this corpus PowerCore, and we created an extension of it called PowerCore Full, annotated for full coreference chain, that's why full. And this was sponsored, funded through EMT, European Association for Machine Translation sponsorship. They have some money, some cost, maybe that every year that you can receive for small projects. This is not really a big sum of money, but something that you can, for example, use for annotation. And this is joint work with Christian Hartmeier, who is in Uppsala, and a colleague of mine, Pauline Krelke, at my Uniwersytet. So the interest is the same. We were interested in English and German, and in full coreference, not only pronominal coreference, because in many frameworks, many studies, including coreference, only pronominal coreference is included because it's the easiest one to get. But we said that we are interested actually in full coreference chains. And again, the same kind of motivation, contrastive linguistic translation studies, well, also machine translation, because Christian Hadmeier is more interested in machine translation, and also for resources. There are not so many resources for English and German. We included many different categories into the annotation of full coreference chains. So first of all, the annotated elements were pronouns, nouns, nominal phrases, but also elliptical constructions. So remember, in Gecko, ellipsis was just another cohesive device, and here we decided, okay, sometimes you have, let's say, the same mention, but this is an ellipsis in a chain, and that's why it's important to include it. As well as verbal phrases and clauses. So we have event anapher here as well. So we have entities, which are represented by pronoun, nominal phrase, events represented by verbal phrase, a clause, or maybe sometimes a set of clauses. So you can also have several clauses that belong to the same unit. Split antecedent.
Sometimes events may be represented by noun clauses, right? So you ignore such.
I would say it's rather structural. I would say it's rather structural difference. I mean, what we included into the scheme, into the annotation scheme, I would say we were driven by a structural point of view. So if you have a verbal phrase, then this is event. And sometimes you're right, there are nominalizations, which are also events. This would be something like abstract noun. I need to have a look at the data to see if you can identify automatically from the annotations these types of constructions as well. What I think is if you have a mention, so not antecedent but a mention, let's say this process, and this process refers to an event, then this process is annotated as it's a mention of an event antecedent. Yes, so if you know that you have a mention whose antecedent is an event, then you can extract it easily. So we have something.
Sometimes there are such things like someone met with someone at this meeting and so on.
Yes. Yeah. In this case, it's covered. Yeah, because so someone met someone is an antecedent, and this is an event antecedent in this case, and this meeting will refer to it. Yeah. This is covered. This kind of by this scheme. We also have split antecedents. So, for example, someone met someone, and then you have something else, and then they went for a coffee. And this meeting, in sense that they met and then they went, so together, it would be a split antecedent. Well, here you have an example, prosperity and opportunity, which is just two nouns, two entities, but we also have sometimes two events which are connected. And we have also a category no explicit antecedent. Sometimes we have an anaphor, but no specific antecedent could be identified. This is especially important for texts which are very ambiguous. Yeah? Sometimes it's really difficult to define what is an antecedent. For the anaphor, we have personal, relative, reflexive, and demonstrative types, including locations, there and here. For example, Saarbrücken there, Warsaw here. Time, then noun, pronominal adverbs. This is something which is very important for German. This is actually a category which exists in some other Germanic languages, I think in Dutch, but does not exist, for example, in German, or in English, sorry. In English you have something like there, thereby, so these words which have a different meaning, and the meaning that is used in German is rather archaic in English, but in German they are frequently used. So this is a conjunction of preposition and a pronoun, or even a definite article. Mostly it's a pronoun, I think. For example, hier, viele Amerikaner haben Probleme mit Rassismus, doch wir sind dagegen immun. So lots of Americans have problems with racism, but we have we have to say it in English.
We're against.
We're against, yeah. Against this. So we don't have the mention of racism, yeah, but we have a referring expression this, which is together with the preposition. Yeah? So which means that if we don't take them into account, we would lose some information on coreference from the text. Nominal phrases include proper nouns and also nominal premodifiers, full nominal phrases with definite article, demonstrative modifier, nominal phrases with quantifiers such as all people in the meaning all these people. We have generic nouns, but only if they co-refer with definite full nominal phrases. Yeah? So if we have repetition of generic, then we don't include them into a coreference chain. Then we have substitution. So referring expression is replaced with another element. This is something which is mostly not included into coreference annotation because it's not really coreference. But we thought that it's important, it's still important, because especially in translation, sometimes instead of coreference in translation is substitution used. Do you prefer the blue shirt or the red shirt? I would like the red one. So one is actually substitution.
Do you also have the red shirt referring with the red one? The red one annotated, or?
Yes.
Oh, that's nice.
But it's not, you can't say that it's a nominal phrase because one is not a noun. And it's important for the language pair English-German, just because in German you would have, you wouldn't have one, you would have just den roten, so the red. And this is an ellipsis, and that's why it's important to include both into the framework, because especially if you work with translation, you would find a lot of cases like this, like the transformation pattern from ellipsis into substitution, vice versa. In English you also have ellipses, cases of ellipses like here, and that's why we included this into. I can't say how many chains contain ellipsis and substitution only, and not any other coreferring expressions, but there are chains which include both. So we said if you have an entity which is mentioned several times, you want to have all the mentions of the same entity or of the same event throughout. And for substitution, we categorize ellipses. We categorize them into nominal, verbal, and clausal, again according to the structural subtypes. Yeah, so for example, if a noun is omitted, then it's a nominal. If a verb is omitted, then it's verbal, and so on. We again use the annex for annotating. This because it's good, it's convenient from the point of view of linking elements, so adding links. And you see that some chains were very long. So this is an example from the corpus where we have news, actually included from the WMT data of news, shared task, translation shared task. And so this is an antecedent, and you have annotation of the categories. For example, this is a simple antecedent, non-split reference, and this is an entity, and then you can choose between the type of expression, if it's a nominal phrase, if it's a pronoun, and so on. The data that we used, the main idea was to extend actually PARCOR, so the corpus PARCOR, which was compiled some years before. But then we said we need to add some more data. We would like to add some more data. For example, for the discourse in machine translation workshop, there was a data set used for shared task, where English was annotated for coreference chains, but the German part was not. They also had French translations, and they were not annotated. And we said, okay, let's take this data as well and add it there, so that we need to, first of all, complete annotation of full coreference chains. So in PARCOR, there were annotation of pronouns and some nominal phrases, but no substitution, for example, no event anaphor. And we said, okay, our task is, first of all, to extend the chains and also to extend the data. Then we said, okay, in case of PARCOR and Disco MT, we work with TED Talks. So the underlying texts come from TED Talks, which is a controversial kind of data, because translations are made by volunteers. First of all, another issue is if you have a look at the guidelines for translators. So they are more or less transcribers, actually, because they are translating subtitles. There are many things that are not so good for annotating, for example, analyzing coreference, because they are allowed to comprise the elements. So, for example, they are allowed to use a noun instead of full nominal phrase. Yeah, so just because of the space, yeah, because these are subtitles, and that's why we decided to include some further data, another domain, another genre, and took the data from the WMT 2017 translation task on news. So we have to have some kind of genre variety. Well, now we have just 2 genres, and TED Talks still are still in the majority, but we have at least a little bit of further data. So here the numbers, you see that the corpus is small, it's not so big. On the total we have 160,000 tokens, and the news part is the smallest one. This was the additional data that we added. So in the end, the feedback from the annotators was that it was easier to work from scratch with the texts that were not pre-annotated. Yeah, so in Parkour there were some annotations, and so the extension of chains was harder than the annotation from scratch of the text. And annotation of WMT text was of course easier, but because the text is smaller. Yeah, you have short news. And if you have a look at the data, well, TED Talks are mostly, well, a kind of popular scientific talks, right? And they're not academic speeches, but they are on some scientific themes, and sometimes it's difficult to interpret, yeah, to understand what the speaker is talking about, although it's popular scientific, so that most people should understand, but sometimes it's still more difficult to understand and to define the members of the chain. And for the news it's much easier, yeah, because you have short text, and mostly, like for example, we had a text about a sportsman and about a politician, so it's much easier to interpret. At the same time, we have a different kind of antecedents in this text, yeah? So maybe more events in one and more entities in the other. So the annotated structures that we have, on the total we have around 15,000 mentions there. And we also counted the number of chains, which is around 5,000. Well, we have slightly more chains in German than in English. But slightly longer chains in English than in German. Well, in fact, we did not perform any contrastive analysis on this, as we did in Gecko, because the aim was different. We evaluated the annotations. For this, we took several texts in English and German. Well, I put it in tokens, and you see that in German you have less tokens, just because if you know German, there are many compound words, which means that a compound word or a compound in English is a multi-word expression, but in German it's just one word. That's why you have always less tokens in corresponding German texts. So we use the mention overlap and entity-based scores between 2 annotations. What we found out is that in the annotation of English texts, annotators agreed better than in the annotation of German texts. And it was very interesting to know, because on the one hand, say, okay, English is more ambiguous than German, so in German you have more structures to express. For example, if you have this, in English is just one form. In German you have diese, dieses, diese, already like referring to, you know, the gender of the structure. That's why it was surprising. We thought that actually German text should be easier to interpret, but it was not the case. We did not perform any qualitative analysis of which texts or which categories they were more problematic in the sense of disagreeing. But I had some feedback from other projects who said, working on German, who said that a lot of cases where annotators disagree are actually cases of abstract categories, of events, for example, because they are more difficult to interpret. And I think, do I have any statistics on this? Well, they have, so German and English have more or less the same number of VPs and clauses annotated, but still German was more difficult in this sense. So it would be interesting to look into the data to understand why. I think it could be another research, maybe a BA thesis or a paper on this. Just one more thing. I mentioned that, so in the first case study that I showed in Gecko, we had comparable data, which means these were not translations of each other. In this case, we had English originals and German translations. And the data was annotated separately, which means that annotator went through English text, through the English text and through the German text separately. Maybe just like having first 5 English texts and then 5 German texts, so not having both texts in front.
And they were German native speakers or English native speakers?
German native speakers.
Maybe they try to make it too much complicated for German.
Yeah, that's why it's so. Yeah, maybe yes. Yeah, so I think there are a lot of different factors that might have an influence on this result there. Yeah, and then we thought, okay, if you have this kind of data, working with parallel data, how would you proceed? What is the right way of annotating it? Shall we annotate it separately, like saying that this is an English text and this is a German text, or shall we see them as a translation, as a kind of the same text in different languages? I think both is interesting, both ways are important, depending on what is your task. So for like, in the end, I will tell you in a minute why. So first of all, we summarizing the results of this project, which is not yet finished. Well, it's finished in sense of the corpus, but you can do many things with this. So this is a parallel corpus with full annotation of coreference, which is available resource for the variety of users. We used it for discovery of inconsistencies. So we said, if you align the sentences or the texts automatically, they are aligned on the sentence level, we can align them on a word level. And in a perfect case, if you have annotation of coreferring expression in English, you should have an alignment of it in the target, which is not the case. And we thought that we might detect them automatically using word alignment, and say, well, we don't have this overmatch, this overlap, then we can see it as an inconsistency in annotation, and then try to find out why the categories in English and German were annotated in this inconsistent way. What we found out is that these are not always really inconsistencies, so sometimes the annotators really interpreted English text different as the German text. In some cases, the scope, so which means the elements that were included into this coreferring expression was different, just again because of the interpretation, because of some, I would say, language contrast issues, and sometimes it was the issue of translation process, because you have, for example, explicitation in translation, translators trying to make things more explicit. In some cases, maybe the data, for example, TED Talks, just because the transcribers had to cut the length of the sentence, they used another construction, and so on. So, in fact, we thought that this data can be used for discovery of these inconsistencies, which deliver some information about language contrast, about what's happening in translation, and maybe some kind of problems in the data as well. And this is something that we started working on, like automatically discover this inconsistency and have a closer look from the point of view of quality. So really looking into the data and trying to understand why it is. Then the data was also used for WNT pronoun translation evaluation. So this year there were some additional evaluation tasks, and several systems which were submitted for WNT shared tasks were evaluated for pronoun translation. And we could see that there are still problems even in the neural machine translation systems with dealing with pronouns. We selected only pronouns, not this full coreference change, but really pronouns, which seem to be the easiest task for translation systems, but there are still problems there. So we would like to find out something about mechanisms involved in coreference translation for a better understanding of the phenomenon. This is like one of the overarching goals of the creation of this resource. And one of the aims was, of course, to create a resource which can be used for coreference area machine translation. Well, the data is very small, relatively small, but we think that it's still possible to use it for some applications. and also for the application for monolingual and multilingual coreference resolution systems. Again, the data is small, but there are not so many annotated corpora that are annotated for coreference for English and German. And as I mentioned, the resource was created within this funding, but the resource is available, it is downloadable, so in this case we can really share the data. Although there are I found out that there are still some issues with TED Talks. Yeah, we contacted them asking if, so I think they don't allow some kind of reuse of the data. So it's possible to use the data, but not like doing something with this and then sharing it. And we ask if annotation can be seen as this kind of reuse of the data, but never got an answer. So again, everyone is using TED Talk, that's why we thought we can also use them and we can also include them into our corpus. I think there are less problems with the news data, which is a smaller part of the corpus. Okay, so this was the first part, going from the theories to the data, in sense of we started with what we know from theories, from grammars about coreference, about this phenomenon, and then trying to identify how coreference looks like in English and in German, and marking this, and then reuse the data with, for example, for different applications. And now I would like to show you an example of using, let's say, shallow annotations like token on the level of token, part of speech, and some dependencies that we use for identifying coreference, or what we think could be part of coreference chain. This is again joint work with Christian Hartmeier from Uppsala, and we call the cases alignment discrepancy. So not a very nice name, but we thought that it's the best term for this. So for you working with machine translation, parallel data, you know how word alignment works in machine translation. Yeah, so in a perfect case we have matches. For example, here we have English nominal phrase which subcategorize for a preposition, and the same in German. And here we have which is an dem, so this is this linking between a preposition and a definite article, and it was aligned to a structure in English. But you know from the practice that it doesn't always work in a perfect way, and sometimes you have aligned sentence pairs where you have problems on the level of words. Right? So there are some mismatches, and we thought, okay, if we have a mismatch of the structures which are somehow related to coreference, then maybe this is a sign of some kind of language contrast or translation problems, and let's have a look at them. So we are interested in discourse-related or coreference-related mismatches. So like in this example, we have educational researcher Benjamin Bloom in 1984 posed what's called this 2 sigma problem, which he observed by studying 3 populations. And in German we have 2 sentences, and we have this structure dis, which is a correspondence of this structure. And the idea was, if we have the aligned sentence, but these 2 structures are not aligned on the word level, we have an error in alignment, then we have this discrepancy, alignment discrepancy, that we're interested in. The motivation behind looking at these structures was that, for example, if you have parallel data that you use for machine translation, these elements are thrown away from the data if they are not aligned, and that's why you could lose some part of discourse information. So in fact, it's just a little bit, a small part of the parallel data that that is not aligned, but we thought that it's still important to have this in the data. So let's have a look at this and these cases. And our aim was to find out what could be the sources, the reasons for these discrepancies, so why these mismatches happen. And the first reason is actually language contrast. For example, like here we have the demographic curve reveal that welfare state can no longer be financed by the younger members of society. This doesn't mean that the country is descending into crisis. And in German we have an element, so this is actually this pronominal adverb. Remember dagegen, the example with dagegen. Here we have da mit, das plus mit. Mit is a preposition. So it can be translated as with this. Well, actually in this way in English. But the thing is that we don't have anything in the English source which can correspond to this damit, and that's why the alignment mismatch happens. Yeah, so that we have an element on the target side which is not aligned to anything in the source. Yeah, so this is an example of a mismatch. You can also have an element in the source which is not aligned to anything in the target, and again it's a mismatch. Then we had, since we performed word alignment just one by one, so we didn't take into account multi-word expressions, we had also mismatches in these cases, like that and die Aufgabe. So actually the Aufgabe is the correspondence of that. But here we have a demonstrative pronoun, but there we have a nominal phrase, full nominal phrase. And from the point of view of translation studies, this is something happening in the translation process, so translator making things more explicit. Yeah? So the Aufgabe, the task, this task, is more explicit than just that. Yeah, and so translators use a lot of explicitation, which are, in terms of coreference, can be represented in like transferring a pronoun into a nominal phrase. So you would probably find more full nominal phrases in the translation than in the source. Yeah, and a mismatch happened just because the word alignment was, as I said, one by one, and not including multi-word expression. Again, an opposite process, having nominal phrase here and having pronoun there, may also happen. Yeah? So this is a case then of implicitation from the point of view of translation studies. And then we had just alignment errors. Yeah, it can also happen that an algorithm produces an error. And in this case, looking at them is also interesting because we may improve an algorithm for word alignment. So the procedure, in how the procedure works, we relate to some works. For example, transformation pattern extraction. In one work, the authors extracted patterns which contained heads, so like matching the heads in the parallel data. Or in the work by Julia Grisham and Manfred Steder, there was they applied a direct projection algorithm on parallel data to automatically produce coreference chains in the target, like having, let's say, annotated source, and they tried to find the same or similar structures in the target using a similar algorithm. And actually, this is the work that inspired us a little bit, because Julia presented several issues where the procedure did not work. Well, she showed some examples, and we said, okay, these examples show actually contrast in the languages and this translation process problems, so let's use this method to detect language contrast and translation process and try to systematically describe them. So in fact, Julia and Manfred used manually annotated data because they used several texts which were already annotated and then projected it onto the not annotated data. And what we are doing, we are not using any manually annotated coreference chains. We are using just part of speech and grammatical function units. And they pointed to a number of cases but did not provide any systematic description of the cases. And we said that it would be interesting to have a look at them. Then we related we referred to contrastive studies, saying that there are differences, yes, from the point of view of contrast. And as said, implicitation and explicitation. There is a number of work in the area of corpus-based translation studies, and also, for example, by Thomas Meyer and Bonnie Weber, who analyzed implicitation, explicitation, both in human and machine translation. Yeah, what's happening there, if the structures in the translation are more implicit or more explicit, but they used conjunctions, yeah, they used connectives and not co-referring expressions. So we use more data, we create a new resource, a kind of parallel resource containing these cases, suggest classification for these cases, and proceed bottom up. So the corpus data that we use is again TED Talks, just because this is something available, and we thought also if we have this procedure for Park full where we go top down, maybe we use this same kind of data for going bottom up, maybe to see some kind of correspondences. We use automatic annotation on the basis of token, lemma, then part of speech, and dependencies using universal dependency tree bank. Why? Just because we thought if we work with two languages, we want to have the same categories in both languages. Well, the praxis showed that it's not always the same category that is marked as the same type, but still it's more useful. And then we use sentence and word alignments for extracting these types of categories that we are interested in. So in the end, we had around 200,000 parallel segments. So a lot of tokens if you compare it to the work performed top down. But at the same time, in the end, you have a lot of cases to go through and to analyze and try to automatize it. It's very difficult. We created a list of discourse-related structures, first of all. So we used the alignment of sentences, word alignment, and then said, okay, only those which we believe are discourse-related, are coreference-related, should be sorted out. And for this, we used universal part of speech and grammatical function. So we decided to take pronouns and determiners only. And then we extracted parallel segments using word alignment, and these parallel segments look like this. So, for example, we have which. Yeah, this example with Benjamin Blue. We have which, and it's marked as a determiner with direct object. And then we have this, which is marked in German as a pronoun. I will actually mark it rather as a determiner with the direct object. Yeah, so we have a kind of pattern, we call them transformation patterns. And we did this for the whole data, but then we restricted ourselves only to the cases where we had something on this side, so for example, which and this marking, but it was not aligned to anything in the target. And vice versa, we had something in the target looking like this, but it was not aligned to anything in the source. Yeah, so we had two lists, in fact. Two lists of patterns. Is it clear? More or less. Yeah, so this was the identification of non-aligned segments. So as I said, it worked on both sides. Yeah, something here which does not have any correspondence there, or something here which does not have any correspondence in the source. And in the English sources, we had 14 patterns. In the German targets, we had 26 patterns. We said, okay, if we try to interpret it from the point of view of translation studies, again going bottom up here from the data to the theories, then we think that this could be cases of implicitation. Yeah, so we have something in the English source which was not translated into German, or translated in another way, and cases of explicitation where we didn't have anything in the source and it was translated, and it was made explicit by translator. And then we put a number of quantitative and qualitative questions. So which are the most frequent structures in the English sources and German translations, and if there are any overlaps. So saying, okay, if we have this kind of patterns, yeah, this you pose universal part of speech and universal dependency marked patterns. Do we have any language-specific patterns which occur on the German side only or in the English side only? Maybe it's a wrong formulation, let's say maybe translation-specific, target-specific and source-specific patterns. And what we found out, well, a number of most frequent structures which actually occur in both languages. So the most frequent ones, they do occur on both sides, but there are less frequent ones that occur either in the target or in the source. And interestingly, 6 of 14, 14 and 25 of 26 patterns were language specific, which means that out of these 26 on the German side, we had 25 that were only in the list for the targets. And those occurring on the source side, there were 8 which were shared, which were in both lists. Okay, so having this huge number of patterns, we need some kind of qualitative analysis in sense of understanding, okay, what kind of phenomena do we deal with? What are these patterns represented by? We had a lot of cases of generics, which means like here we have people and in German die Leute, so generics are used without any article in English, but we have an article in our data in German. I had a look in German grammars and tried to find out something about generics, the usage of generics, so the usage of definite articles with generics, and there was no rule about it actually. Because some of them were mentioning that you don't need an article, the others that you do. Then we had the cases of explicitation. I would expect it to be cheesy, but it's not. And then in German you have der Fall, so a full nominal phrase. And we also had the cases of implicitation, where we had some longer construction in the English source, but shorter construction in the German target. Which could be in this case, of course, something coming from the data, just because the transcribers had to compress the sentence, make it shorter.
So I think the basic rule about the English generics is that it depends on number. When you have plural, you don't use the definite article. When you have singular, you do, right? So you can say that lions are mighty animals, or the lion is a mighty animal, right? They are not generics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but in some cases, I think in the data you have also computer, which was not used with a definite article, I suppose.
In the singular, I think you would have to say the computer is an evil machine or something like that. Well, anyway, sorry, just...
Yeah, and in German, if you have a plural, die Leute, you could also say Leute, just Leute without a definite article, but it doesn't sound that beautiful than using it with a definite article. So I suppose it would be interesting to have a look at the cases where we have a definite article in English, and if there are correspondences, there are matches in the parallel data with the German die Leute, and if the match is really the number. I think it would be interesting. So there are many things that we could do with this, let's say, disaligned data which has these mismatches in the end. We have cases with finite and non-finite constructions in English and German. So in fact, if we look at English and German, the grammatical systems, they have a lot of similar categories. Yeah, for example, ing form, so participle, does exist in German and Partizip 1. And in this case, if we have polar bear swimming in the Arctic, and you could say I'm in der Arktis schwimmende Polarbeer, which, well, it might be used in a very strict formal registers, but not in TED Talks probably. And that's why such constructions like this in English are frequently transferred into German with a relative clause, not only into German, but also in other languages. So in fact, some constructions that exist in one language only, well, you need a kind of equivalence in the target, and then you try to express this in another way. And so we had a lot of cases like this. Then we had cases of impersonalization. So this is something signaling contrast not only on the language level but also the cultural level. So how do we give talks in English or in German, especially scientific talks or popular scientific talks. So in this sentence you have, if you have fluid with no wall to surround it and keep pressure up, you have a puddle. So the English TED Talks have a lot of you, a lot of reference to the audience, so kind of you and you. And in the German translations, you don't have any reference to the audience. So the speaker addressee reference issues, they differ in both languages. And we also had cases which deal with syntax or cohesion. So for example, some days it goes up and some days it doesn't go up. In German, you can use a construction with an ellipsis in this case, which is not possible in English. So from the point of view of syntax and also cohesion. Okay, summarizing all these cases, we thought, okay, we need some theories to try to understand what's happening. So first of all, generics. The rules for generics, the rules for the transformation of generics between English and German, they are not described in any contrastive grammars and any contrastive studies. And first of all, we went to corpus-based translation studies, to explicitation hypothesis. There is this explicitation hypothesis which has been criticized by many scholars, where, again, we say translations are more explicit than non-translations. And later on, Claudia suggested classification for it. She said that there are different cases of explicitation. The explicitation doesn't take place just because it needs to be, because it's a translation, but it can be obligatory, optional, pragmatic, or translation-specific. Or it can be a scale of explicitation, so no explicitation, light explicitation, and strong. We said, okay, maybe this 1 and 2 can be used for our cases. We can say that we have obligatory, so coming from systemic differences between the languages. So when we don't have any explicitation, then we have a non-grammatical construction in the target. So we have to make something explicit in the target. And we can have optional explicitation, which is genre or domain, or style-driven explicitation. So if we don't use explicitation, then the sentence may sound unnatural in the target language. And the same not also about explicitation, but maybe also about the usage of certain constructions, like this ice bear swimming in the Arctic. So it's possible to use a construction, the same kind of construction from the point of view of structure, but we decide for another one because of the genre, because of the style. And another explanation attempt is coming back to contrastive pragmatics and contrastive grammar. From the point of view of contrastive pragmatics, I mentioned, okay, there are differences between English and German culture, how to present. There are even some works, for example, by Juliane Haus, who describes that German is more content-oriented and English is more addressee-oriented, if someone is speaking. And as I said, we had a lot of cases in English where we had you and you, and we have transformations from finite to non-finite constructions. So this is less passive, not passive, but at least not personal construction. And here we have active-passive. Something was turned into passive, just not to mention you. So the German translators who translated this material, this data, decided always for a construction without mentioning you. Well, there were some, of course, that They just transferred it from the English word by word. And we thought this is something which is regularly happening. Probably these are the cases that we could try to use automatic procedures to classify the cases, like extracting the cases like this, and maybe trying to categorize them in an automatic way, because going through the whole data manually just takes a lot of time. And yeah, so as I said, contrastive pragmatics and contrastive grammar, describing contrast between English and German, but in fact you don't find any systematic description between how certain constructions are used in English in German or English-German translation to make things more impersonal, for example. Yeah, so these transformation patterns that we are interested in as translators, yeah, that we say, okay, we know that we need to make a construction impersonal, but we need a kind of number of rules how to do this. Yeah. So, dealing with machine translation, you can train the data, train the system on the parallel data, and if the parallel data contains a lot of cases like this, then you might come up with some rules. Yes. Okay, the summary, we used parallel corpus to quantitatively describe discrepancies. Yeah, quantitatively means that we had this number of patterns and could see what are the differences between English sources and German targets in terms of these patterns, but the patterns were not that informative in terms of interesting cases from the linguistic point of view, from the translation point of view. And looking qualitatively in the data, we found interesting examples which were maybe in some cases different from what traditional grammars were telling us. And in future we would like to include more cases for the analysis, for the qualitative analysis. Use maybe these discrepancies for alignment improvement, yeah, to improve because the structure should be, well, I think in some cases we can improve the alignment if we include multi-word expressions, so saying that this multi-word corresponds to one word in the target or vice versa. And then we would like to try to automatize these categorizations, so the categories that I presented to you, and try to detect them in an automatic way. And the idea, Christian's idea was also to use these cases to improve models in order to avoid overgeneration, yeah, because if you have something in the data which does not correspond to anything in the target, then the model can overgenerate these cases. Okay, and the last example, which is also bottom up, but it's not that, let's say in the case of alignment discrepancies we had a lot of data, we still have a lot of data and a lot of cases that we couldn't have a look at just because of the not having the possibility to automatically classify them. In my joint work with Anna Nibelushko from Prague, we decided to have a look at certain examples only. So remember these pronominal adverbs. In German, we said, okay, this is an interesting case of a phenomenon which can be either coreference or it can also be a linking element, so it can also be connective. For example, here, if you have a look at this sentence, wir haben gelernt, dass viele Leute betrügen können, der Einzelne betrügt dabei nur ein bisschen. This dabei may be seen as a connective which may express temporal meaning or contrast and concession, depending on how you interpret the sentence. It can also be a referring expression, like while this, yeah, so the connection, preposition and co-referring expression. So this is a multifunctional element, and we said if we analyze the corresponding cases in the parallel data, like looking at English, Czech and Russian, the languages that we can at least understand and analyze, we could see, for example, in the translations, in the corresponding sentences, the function of the element, of the corresponding element, and in some way disambiguate and understand what is the function of the German one. So if you have a look at this 4 sentences in English, German, Czech, and Russian. We have English source. Unfortunately, we always had just English sources just because there is no data in German which was translated into English, Czech, and Russian. And we have a lot of data in English which was translated into many different languages. So in the source sentence, we've learned that a lot of people can cheat. They cheat just by a little bit. You don't have any linking element between these 2 sentences. In the German sentence, you have dabei. In the Czech sentence, you have a connector with this contrast function, contrast concession. And in the Russian translation, you have a connector and then also a referring expression. So depending on how translators interpret the source sentence, they add some elements. And so we decided our procedure was taking parallel data in the 4 languages and extracting only those, how can you call them? 4 sentence pairs, and these are not pairs already because you have 4. Whose German part contains a pronominal adverb, and then have a look at these cases. So our observations were that pronominal adverbs are frequent in German and rarely occur in other languages. They are ambiguous, and there is a great variation in their equivalence in the corresponding languages, which could already be seen on the example of 1 sentence. And German seems to be more explicit if pronominal adverbs are considered. More explicit if you compare German to other languages that we had. So we analyzed multilingual parallel sentences extracted from TED Talks and WMT. So we had news and TED Talks. We wanted to discover and analyze various means that correspond to the German pronominal adverbs in English, Czech, and Russian, describe their function usage preference, trying to find systematically, or some kind of systematical use in their functions, and find out what impact may translation process have on the choice in languages. Well, sometimes you don't know what the choice of translator was, why some individual decisions of translators, what they were influenced by. Well, our observations were that functions of German pronominal adverbs are genre-specific because we had more anaphoric functions of pronominal adverbs in TED Talks, which are popular scientific talks. An example of anaphoric function could be here. A brilliant late tackle from Marcus Watson secured the win and ultimately the silver medal. And when we have damit, which means with this is again a case of explicitation. So with a brilliant late tackle from Marcus Watson secured the win, and with this, then ultimately the silver medal. So it's not used in the English. It's also in this way. In this way can be also used in English. And another function that I didn't mention at the beginning for the pronominal adverbs is a correlative, which means that it's a kind of placeholder for something which comes later. Like here, die Bedeutung des Wortes Patient habe nichts damit zu tun. So damit introduces actually this clause, Ratschläge zu geben. So infinitive clause which follows, and it could be also not only infinitive clause, it could be also that clause, why clause, and so on. So with this kind of it's a kind of katapha, but not really. It's a grammatic thing. In the English source, you have the word patient doesn't mean to make suggestions. So nothing like this, no elements like this. So correlative function was predominating in the news. So you had a lot of cases like this in the news, and anaphoric function in the TED Talks. We thought that, well, if you have a look at the transformation patterns, then we see again some language contrasts. So, for example, verbal valency. Hören Sie damit auf, like stop it. In German, you need to use a preposition. Yeah, it's obligatory from the point of view of valency, of subcategorization of the verb. Then we have syntactic construction, so English gerunds, we had already this in the previous study, like Polabia swimming. I dream of bringing, ich träume davon zu bringen. Yeah, again, we can't use it in the same way as we have in English. So in Polish it would be marzy o tym. So we would probably also use a kind of correlative here. And then, so this is some kind of construction which do not have equivalence in the target languages, and that's why translators have to use some additional elements which we find explicit. And then from the point of view of translation process, explicitation and implicitation, we can have zero and then some discourse elements, so this kind of pronominal adverb, or less explicit, more explicit element. Like here, I didn't know if I could do that and preserve my art. Ich wusste nicht, ob ich das bewerkstelligen und dabei, so dabei means like doing this, the whole thing. And in the Czech translation, you also had both elements that we used in the German translation. Well, we used again a parallel corpus for which we could analyze again just a small number of examples, because this categorization for the reasons, language contrast and translation process were done manually. Well, we discovered interesting language contrasts in use, again, which in some cases either differ from what traditional grammars say, or let's say in some traditional grammars there is no description, because there is no actually contrastive grammars describing contrasts for all 4 languages, or at least for 2 languages. And at the same time we found out some translation phenomena interesting for translation process. And for future work, we would like to analyze more cases. So we already have, I think, around 3,000 or 4,000 segments, parallel segments, that we would like to have a look at and try to automatize the categories. For example, at least differentiating between correlative use and anaphoric use of these examples. So in fact, this is a resource for a variety of uses, again, because it contains on both sides some elements which have to do something with coreference or other discourse-related devices. Well, using 2 approaches and coming from contrastive linguistics or from translation studies, or again using the resources for natural language processing, I'm always not sure which way to go. Either use the theory and then work with manual annotation, and in the end have some small resources which could be used for some small applications, or maybe start from the data. We have a lot of data then in this case. Like for example, in the 3rd study we had 200,000 parallel sentences, and in case of Parkoffel, we have just 160,000 tokens. But at the same time, we have a great number of examples that we again have to go through manually, and so to be able to interpret. Yeah, so to be able to bring it back to the theories, we have to somehow look through the data, and so probably a combination of both is good in this case. Yeah, so doing both and trying to find the golden middle in these 2 approaches. And thank you very much for your attention. I tried to find some alignment discrepancies in these parallel sentences in Polish. I hope it's correct. If you say thank you very much for your attention. Dziękuję bardzo za uwagę. Dziękuję Państwu bardzo za uwagę. Dziękuję bardzo za Pańską uwagę. Yeah, okay, but in all of the cases you have discrepancies from the methodological point of view that I present. Okay, thank you.